Welcome to Behind the Shield, IBM X-Force's expert TV show. I am Nick Bradley of the X-Force Incident Command.
And I am Mitch Main, the Public Information Officer for IBM X-Force.
You know, Mitch, it's good to see you again. I was concerned that I was going to have to replace you because, Dave was on for a couple of these, and Dave Bales did a really good job in your stead.
Nick, you know that I'm irreplaceable. Well, in all seriousness, it is good to be back. I have missed being here. This is one of the favorite parts of my job. So I'm excited to get to this today. So what are we going to do?
We have a lot to unpack in today's episode. I don't see us getting through it all in one sitting, to be honest. Talking about critical infrastructure and the threats to it is going to be like peeling an onion. We got a lot of layers to get through.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because it is a big bucket. And that's kind of one of the reasons that I want to talk about it. And I'm curious to talk about it. If for those of you out there who are intimately familiar with what CISA defines as critical infrastructure, all of the warnings that we've been hearing about probably make a little bit of sense. But let's face it, the number of people who really know what critical infrastructure is and what that phrase means is a pretty small segment of the population, I think, even inside the cybersecurity industry. So it's really hard for us to put those warnings into context. And that's what we're going to try to do today.
Warnings. So many warnings. Anyway, on that note, let's bring on today's guests. With us today, we have the Hyposec CEO, Chris Kubetska. Chris, it is great to see you again.
Great to see you too.
And from our own side of the house, we have strategic threat analyst, Michael Worley, or Mike. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, guys. Excited to be here.
Chris, is it just me, or is that a new title for you since the last time we talked? Have things changed for you? Hopefully a good way.
Well, no, I have been concentrating a bit on Hyposec a little bit more than the Middle East Institute due to some of the things happening in Europe lately.
Okay.
Very veiled, very veiled. Mike, over to you. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on with you, your role as a threat analyst here. And you have a pretty interesting background, I think, that's going to tie in fairly nicely with the topics we want to cover today.
Yeah, thanks. I joined IBM's threat intel production team about a year ago after 9 years in the intelligence community, covering Russia and the region from a military, cyber, and intelligence perspective. So during some of the landmark events kind of in this area over the last decade or so.
Good. I was not wrong. That will be interesting to cover this stuff.
Well, that explains again why you are the one that we wanted to bring on here with us. So let's kick this off first, though, by setting a baseline, because if we don't, I think we're going to be all over the place. When we use the term critical infrastructure, what exactly are we talking about? I mean, I've seen a lot of things included in government definitions of critical infrastructure that made me raise an eyebrow, maybe even both eyebrows, but then that's weird and doesn't establish the exact same thing I was trying to accomplish in the first place. But anyway, I want to limit this to three industries: communications, energy, and then water. And I can think that includes wastewater systems as well. Chris, does that work for you?
That works for me.
And Mike, are you good with that? We're going to stick with those ones?
Yeah, I think those are three big ones that a lot of stuff has been going on in those areas especially in the last year. So
I'm glad we decided to narrow it down because the bill of goods and services that are included in what we define as critical is really massive, which makes it sort of hard to put the warnings that we're all seeing into context because nobody really understands where they apply and how. So I'm glad we're talking about this today. And I want to start off with a question to both of you. And Mike, we're going to go to you first. And let's talk a little bit about, given those three sectors or industries within that list of critical, what does the threat landscape really look like for them today?
Sure, yeah. As I mentioned, I think these three industries have seen some notable attacks in the last year or two. Broadly speaking, these three can be held at risk from any number of threat actors, whether state-sponsored or criminal or otherwise, looking to achieve a number of different purposes. Communications, I think, to start with, is just a target for like all of those threats, all of those types of actors. It can be really high value to a state-sponsored espionage group, say, is one really good threat use case. access and information on who's been in contact with who, what they're saying. Those kinds of things are great for intelligence, counterintelligence, and other targeting value. And then when it comes to energy and wastewater systems, this gets more into the ICS, industrial control systems, and some of the operational technology networks and those kinds of components. And not to discount threats to IT and information technology, those kinds of how they're interconnected in those facilities and how an interruption of those might just be able to disrupt operations themselves. But targeting those systems really get to a different kind of intent, right? It's usually reserved for threat actors that have the resources and the interest in trying to hold those assets at risk. So, in the last year, just in the last few weeks here, actually, the Ukrainian energy sector was a target. And then last year, the water wastewater system made a lot of news here in the US and Florida last year. So these are some these good kind of use cases here across and kind of pretty widely applicable cyber threat landscape.
So you mentioned a word here that we're going to get to in a second, and that was interconnected. And we do want to talk about how these things sort of work together. But Chris, let's actually pivot to you really quickly and give us your 2 cents on what the threat landscape is here.
Well, it is definitely changing, not for the better. Some of the things that have been going on, especially in the last 2 months, dealing with Ukraine and Russia, to explain some of the interconnected relationships when the Russians tried to take out Zelensky's satellite communications due to the interconnected fact of life. Part of the satellite communication system was actually taken out from the French Space Agency, and it also affected part of maritime because vessels of certain length also use that type of communications as either number 3 or number 4 for redundancy for communications. So it had widespread effects, which folks did not enjoy, except for the Russians. We're talking about energy. That's kind of important because it powers everything like communications and water, and there's this symbiotic relationship between water and energy. And the Ukraine recently did a very smart move. They actually disconnected from the Russian power grid to connect to the EU power grid. So at least in my mind, since I've seen that happen before in other regions of the world, if Russia were to then directly try to attack and take out part of the Ukrainian grid, and it actually affected the rest of the EU and deharmonized, then that could mean an escalation of war involving the European Union and NATO. And of course, we all need clean water, and more of these attacks are occurring, so much so that the Israelis a couple of years ago actually set up a hotline for water operations, 311 instead of 911, so that if they believed that they were coming under a cyber attack, that they could contact 311 and get an immediate response from the Israeli government to assist them.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed that there has been a smart focus by Russia in keeping things targeted on Ukraine. Not obviously saying that's a good thing, but what I mean by that is the more they focus there and the less they start slapping everybody else around, the less they're going to be able to, I think, trigger others to move against them as well. Like you were saying, it's at that point they start committing acts of war against other nations that have not really thrown their hat in the ring to get fully involved quite yet. But when you do that, it changes things, right?
Well, it can change things, and that's one of the big worries. There have been some spillover in EU and NATO countries. It just hasn't gotten a lot of media. So, for example, about 2 days after the war started, our intelligence agencies in the Netherlands actually caught Russian actors trying to take over home and business routers, affecting the communications. They were trying to turn them into a gigantic botnet, but they were stopped. We've seen attacks against not infrastructure so much, but attacks against certain types of not highly important or critical government web services in Finland or in Sweden. We've also seen an increase in different types of very interesting and not so nice propaganda and disinformation and misinformation that has been spreading to places like Romania and Bulgaria, Hungary, Slovakia, etc., trying to move people towards saying, hey, Russia is actually our savior, which I can tell you from personal experience is not the case. So it's multi-pronged, not doing something that would cause loss of life or limb, but agitation that couldn't be considered an act of war.
Right. And I want to keep going in that vein. And so you've already sort of answered the next question, because I was going to ask what other types of attacks we've seen, US and abroad. But the other question I have then is, are we less or more vulnerable today when it comes to these critical infrastructure sectors?
That's a good question, because we increased exposure online and some of these sectors due to the pandemic. Because, hey, we're not meeting in person. We don't want to die from the plague. So due to a rapid increase, there has also been a lot of connectivity that has been set up quite hastily and not always the most secure. Now, we've known that these types of attacks can and will occur, but at the same time, not every country has fully prioritized the importance of it. And now, of course, we're in a bit of a crisis, at least, with Ukraine and Russian issues. And I don't think we're as prepared as we should be.
Mhm.
And I think that's due to, and I'm going to say an ugly word, lack of regulation.
Ooh.
Oh, I hope you censor that out.
I'm not going to censor it out, only because I agree with you. And it actually pains me deeply to say that, because I am usually a very anti-regulation type person. But when it comes to things like this, I can't argue, right? This isn't putting regulations on, a little mom and pop shop. This is putting a regulation on something that literally affects the lifeblood of a country's ability to survive. So I'm okay with a little bit of regulation there. So let's stay with that flow here and go back to you, Mike. What's your take on all this, if you feel like jumping into that fire that Chris and I just started?
Yeah, I'm actually going to avoid that fire, but I will say, just to kind
Professionally played.
Yeah, no, just to raise a couple of, speak to some of the historical examples we've seen of operations targeting, whether it's, one of these specific sectors or other sectors, right? Dating back to as early as 2011 and running through at least 2018, there was a probable Russian state-sponsored group doing a lot of reconnaissance against ICS and SCADA related networks. A lot of that seemed to be going. There was a couple different groups probably involved in that in different operations, but a lot of that could possibly set some of those up for future attacks, or kind of help advance and mature some of their attack, the kind of capabilities that they were looking to develop and mature. The two big examples, I think, very relevant again here in given current circumstances, were in Ukraine in 2015 and Ukraine in 2016. I think 2015 was like a watershed moment. That was the first time there was a remote compromise of a OT network in order to shut off the electricity, right? So the first cyber attack against an electric grid that led to a power outage. That affected about 250,000 people across several regions in Western Ukraine. It happened at the low-level distribution level in substations, and basically was a remote operation to flip circuit breakers on human-machine interfaces. And there's videos of keyboards and mice, the legitimate operators trying to control their mouse and flip the circuit breakers while the mouse the cursor is floating around the screen uncontrolled. So. We go from that in 2015 to the next year, significant advancement in the deployment of what was called in-destroyer or crash override across the industry. That was a tailored piece of ICS-specific malware that capable of automatically interacting with specific ICS components, and it targeted a substation at the transmission level, so would have affected potentially a lot more customers. And this was outside of Kiev. That took the power out for about an hour. Beyond that, some related threat groups a year later went what I see as the kind of final frontier in developing a cyber attack program. And when I say cyber attack, I mean something that's like a physical, disruptive, destructive event. But the development and deployment of Trisis malware, which specifically targeted safety instrumented systems. In this case, I think it was actually a malfunctioning of within the malware that triggered a safety shutdown of the plant itself. But the intent was there to be able to manipulate these things, cause potentially unsafe conditions, physical damage to a facility, but most important, loss of life and holding humans' lives at risk. So there's not really many more places you can go there, but we've got this full suite, I think, of cyber attack capabilities that are at play. And this speaks to a lot of, I think, why we're hearing a lot about warnings against about Russian malicious cyber activity against critical infrastructure. And that's not even yet getting to the most recent news of things like Industry 2, the next iteration of Industry used in 2016, that was reported last week in a foiled attack against Ukrainian electric grid. And then the most recent reports of InController or Pipe Dream. That's a broadly applicable kind of malware framework that could be used across a lot of different industries. So that is a really interesting scenario in which the community has been able to understand something and report on it before there was actually an attack. So we're in a little bit different position there, and a stronger position than we were in years past. But I think it just really speaks to, again, those something that we keep trying to impress upon our clients is these are real, the threats are real. Whether we've seen them or not so much and so widely in the last couple of weeks isn't really a question as much as just to be prepared for the possibilities.
You know, with everything you've said there, I kept picking up on like a couple little Star Trek-isms. You've said, you know, Final Frontier, then you start talking about Life and Limb, and then I start realizing I'm the one wearing the red shirt, and it just made me want to say to our clients, don't be a red shirt.
Yeah. Dude, your nerd's showing. However, I have to agree with you about the red shirt. Man, live long and prosper, red shirt. Let's get back to this though, because this is interesting to me. And Mike, you started a thread that I kind of want to yank on a little bit, and that's talking about these warnings themselves. So I'm going to start with Chris. I'm going to pick on Chris first. So I'm seeing a lot of reports out there from folks in the industry who are saying, well, you know, we've had these warnings for 2 months now and nothing's really come of it. They must be much ado about nothing. Maybe Russia doesn't have their act together. Maybe they're focusing on other areas. Maybe it's still to come. What's your take on people who say that it's actually not happening as severely or as seriously as we thought it might? And I suspect I know your answer, but I want to hear it.
Well, the good news is one of the things that the conflict has shown us is cyber war is not like a Hollywood movie where the moment someone scans an operational network, boom, everything blows up.
You mean it's not like the movie Black Hat?
No. Instead, it's a bit more insidious, and also there has been.
My life is a lie.
I know, right? There's been a global effort, or almost global effort, to help protect Ukraine and countries that have been siding with them. So you've got European entities, US entities, tech companies, individuals, security researchers, different types of computer emergency response teams. Like when I was sending around malware samples in a safe way, for some of the things that I had observed in Ukraine while I was there, there's this massive coordination effort to try to keep these types of attacks down. And it is kind of like, I would say, an allied effort on the cyber front, involving all of these different parties that are facing massive attacks every day, either seeing them in Ukraine and trying to stop them, or against themselves, because once it's known that a company or an individual might be helping, then suddenly they become a target as well. So there's all this stuff that's been going on in the background that's been massive, and probably, hopefully, when this war ends very soon, it'll actually come out, all of these massive efforts. So that's one of the reasons why things have not been going boom in terms of cyber attacks.
Well, would it be wrong of me to drop the reminder that up until recently, Ukraine had its own fair share of bad actor groups, and so they were a part of that landscape long before this situation took place. And so I would imagine some of that retaliatory effort against Russia might be those same bad actor groups that in the past we were tracking as bad guys. Just saying.
Just saying.
And let's go to you on this. Actually, jump in here. I want to hear your perspective on these warnings. Are they legit? Are they hot or hype?
Yeah, you know, kind of to Nick's point there, Ukraine and Russia have basically been at war, de facto at war, since at least 2014, right? So in terms of, I agree with Chris on the idea of a cyber war, right? It's been something that's been warned about for over a decade, and the possible implications of that, kind of have been maybe overplayed. Maybe, I don't know if they've been overstated yet, but that's something that just future will tell. But this is a de facto war zone for the last 8 years. So I think what we've seen to date in terms of cyber-related developments in the Russian war in Ukraine have been mostly a continuation of what we saw for the previous 8 years. Something we've been noting is the appearance of 8 different wipers, right? That's in the space of 2 months. That's notable for sure. Is it so far outside the realm of the familiar? Certainly not for Ukrainian network defenders. Again, I've already spoke about there being ground zero for power outages in 2015 and 2016. It was ground zero for the globally destructive NotPetya campaign. These things, the Ukrainian networks are familiar with these things. The government has been targeted probably left, right, and center by all kinds of Russian threat groups, not to mention things like their railways, even Kyiv's international airport, right? So these networks have all found similar malware, similar infection and compromises in the past. So in that way, yeah, I don't think that it's not the warnings, as I've already said. I think they're not hype. It's that Russia has demonstrated a particular capability to affect Ukrainian networks, and they've also shown a real affinity for a retaliatory cyber operation, whether it's within critical infrastructure, as we've seen in war zones, as kind of Chris already alluded to previously as well. There's a freedom of operation in Ukraine and Ukrainian networks that Russia has not yet breached elsewhere, certainly not within NATO networks and allied networks. But they've done plenty of other retaliatory cyber operations, such as hacking athletes' medical data in response to exposure of their state-sponsored doping program, and banned from the 2016 Olympics, again with the Olympic destroyer in 2018. So those things, they could still come, and we see those as kind of blueprints for potential future operations that Russia might try to pull again.
Right. And one of the things that I did want to mention, I've said this before, and you kind of reiterated that by talking about this being the de facto war zone, and it's been kind of like this for, the 8+ years, is if all of a sudden now you have decided to see Russia as a threat and to up your security posture, you waited too long. They were already a threat long ago. This didn't just start with the situation in Ukraine. They've already been doing bad things. These bad actor groups out of Russia doing the things they've been doing didn't just start in January.
Right. No, this is, probably 30 to 40 year long development of their cyber program in support of their state goals, whether it's espionage, influence, or attack. So they've definitely been a longstanding cyber threat. How applicable they are to any individual organization is obviously very dependent on those. But something else it kind of raises another thing we've talked to a lot of clients about. Yes, it's a clear and present threat. Yes, the potential for retaliatory cyber attacks or things that might spill over outside, or more broadly spill over outside of the Ukrainian conflict, they could be coming. But maintaining your threat model that has kept you safe to this point in time, that's also something not to lose sight of.
No, you're stealing the next question here.
Yeah,
so
I'm sorry.
we're gonna stop here, but
He totally was, right?
I know he did. But I wanted
you guys to just straightly turn this from organization into chaos.
well, chaos is where we do our best work. I mean, come on, look at the 4 of us. So I want to actually bring up something that you talked about too, which I think is a good point. So X-Force is actually offering clients one-on-one briefings on threat intelligence around the Russia-Ukraine conflict. That's true, right, Michael?
Very much so. Yeah, I've been doing a lot with my colleagues as well.
So for those of you who are watching, if you're interested in that, you can message either me or Nick, and we will plug you into the process on how to get one of those. So speaking of chaos, Nick, I'm going to turn it back. I'm just turn it back over to you, because I think you have something chaotic to ask.
I do, but why does it matter at this point if we're just going to be chaotic? You could have asked my question. Then it would have just been crazy. Cats and dogs living together.
I know, the world's ending.
So let's go back to how the different sectors interact together, because I think we brought that up a little bit earlier and kind of stopped it because we didn't want to get ahead of ourselves because we knew this question was coming. But in interactivity between the sectors we're covering here, could a successful attack in one of these sectors really have consequences for another? And Chris, we're going to go to you first on that.
Oh, I think absolutely. I mean, we have this symbiotic relationship between water and electricity production, which is quite important. Then to be able to have communications between different portions of, for example, water is a good one. Typically, a pump pumping water into the system is kind of far away from people. It's kind of loud. And you still need connectivity. You also need connectivity, especially in light of different types of smart metering and so forth, which, by the way, a lot of smart meters are not very secure. And so connectivity is required to make sure that the manufacturer that the facilities may have a support contract with, things are operating as they should, they hold connectivity to that. So communicating with those different types of assets is very important to keep that up. So if you were to take out electricity, how do you deal with water? If you take out water, how do you deal with other knock-on effects, like certain types of production require not only electricity, but a certain level of clean water to be able to manufacture automobiles, for example, which there seems to be a shortage of in this world, or different types of chips and so forth. And if you can't communicate between all of these different entities, especially around the world, because we no longer live in small villages where we have bare bones servers and keep hold of them and hug them, we have things far flung places all over the world. Then you're not going to be able to know if something has gone up, gone down, if you can sell it, if it's a complete loss, or if it's just turned into absolute chaos.
Right, for sure. And I'd love to know what kind of connectivity you have out there on that beach. The wind there is probably interfering with it.
Wait, wind power, solar power. Wake up, Mitch. It's wind power.
All right, Mike, over to you on that one.
Yeah, no, I think Chris already hit all of the great points there. You know, obviously the communications as being a backbone for providing the connectivity between substations across the electric grid and and within water systems as well. And I think it's important though to note that the electric sector, these the owners and operators of all those diverse facilities across the entire electric grid, across the country, across the world, they're just as aware of the importance that linchpin kind of they are within across all these sectors, right? They're designed for resilience. They're designed with the idea that they can get back up and running in mind. And they deal with that a lot more frequently with things like trees on lines and squirrels frying themselves and other lines than they are dealing with, a remotely caused power outage. So there's some level of comfort there, knowing that there's people running these industries and with the knowledge of how to keep it safe and keep it running, keep us safe.
Well, on the note of keeping us safe, this is going to be a little bit of a broad question, but I'm hoping you guys can kind of boil it down for us. Let's assume that you're having a quick conversation with a CISO or an executive of one of these three sectors or one of these three industries. What are going to be the two things that you tell that individual to do to stay safer? Chris, we'll go with you.
I was about to say, since Mitch is enjoying and relishing in the chaos,
I am enjoying the chaos.
Let's go to Chris first.
Well, one of the things you can do, number one, is understand what your exposure actually is. Typically, the larger and older the organization, they'll forget about an orphan server or some sort of asset or things that they think that they're controlling that's a third party, or it's gone by the wayside, and it could be a pivot point inside further either to the business network or to operational technology. You just don't know. Heck, I've seen on a solar power grid, somebody plugged in a network area storage device directly on the OT network so that they could get music. And of course, there are many NASs that are not very safe in terms of security. So knowing what you have enables you to go, all right, these are our risks and this is what we actually need to do. So try to be proactive. I'm not sure if I came up with the term or someone else did, but proactive defense is a good way to look at it. Another thing is be prepared to incorporate any sort of major cyber incident into your existing business plans. Don't make it seem so exotic that you're not going to want to touch it. People aren't going to want to get near it and are going to flee as quickly as possible. But it's part of your regular business operations. So if you need to schedule downtime to do various maintenance to make sure that you minimize or mitigate certain risks, do that. And I would say a third thing is talk with your technology partners, because they're going to be able to advise and help with some of that minimization and mitigation of risk.
Mike, what's your take?
Yeah, those are the top three ones that we're sharing with our clients for the most part too. Just on top of that, I think personally that the USG and the private sector partners are killing it on information sharing over the last couple of months. I direct anybody watching this, if that already hasn't, to go look at those advisories, those alerts, some of the most recent reporting. Make sure that those things, the IOCs where applicable, are ingested, and then you're actually doing some of the behavioral based detections that are going to be important to control, protect against things like in control and pipe dream. Other things that we talk about with our clients and that clients have kind of brought up to us actually, maybe a little bit often repeated, maybe kind of familiar, but sometimes these things are, they're often repeated, they might be ignored, but they usually do help in securing your environments. Changing default credentials, that's still showing up that showed up in Schneider's alert talking about in controller, right? This is one of the things. Change your default credentials, ensure passwords and accounts are up to date, force resets if they're not. A client of ours told us about issuing one-time use and time-bound administrator and more privileged account credentials, right? So like 24-hour use and that's it. And now you need to come back and get more. So those I thought that was a really good one that we've shared with some other clients, both in these sectors and across some other critical infrastructure and manufacturing sectors. Isolating, just one more point on Chris's about being prepared for an incident response. Part of that is also being prepared to isolate those operational networks and your critical infrastructure in the case of those, and testing manual operations and being able to do that, whether it's to keep a business running or help keep some lights on, but certainly minimize again the risks to people and customers. And then lastly, I would just say conducting active threat assessments and threat hunting, pen testing, including scanning OT networks specifically for any external connections, would help to identify any ongoing or recent compromises.
Right, and keep that IR plan up to date and practiced.
Very much so, very much so.
So on that note, Chris, Mike, I think we are just about out of time, but I would like to thank you so much for jumping on here and doing this with us today. I know it's painful at times, but thank you again. And I'd love to have you on again. Mitch?
I absolutely agree. And I think, Nick, next time we go to Chris's location, and
Right.
Mike, you're probably on board with that.
Yeah,
I'm all for a beach. I could definitely use one. So let's do it. And Nick, you bring the sunscreen, and Mike, you bring the cooler. Chris, we're just going to be, camping out with you.
Hackers on a beach. Done.
Awesome. All right. Again, thank you both for your time.
Thank you guys.
Cheers.
And thank you all for watching today. We look forward to seeing you on our next episode.
For IBM Security X-Force, I am Mitch Main.
And I am Nick Bradley, and you've been Behind the Shield.